Every town holds one story. People whisper about years later, the kind that makes strangers cry and believers pray. For Maplewood, that story began with a dog sitting by a school gate waiting for someone who didn't know she was being waited for. Before the truth unfolded, hearts would break and heal in the same breath. Stay with me, hit like subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, because this story will test what you think love is made of. It was a cold October morning in the quiet town of Maplewood, Vermont, when Mrs. Ellen Brooks first saw the German Shepherd sitting by the school gate. The sun hadn't yet cut through the mist, and the chill of dawn hung in the air like a memory that refused to fade. Ellen, who had taught at Maplewood Elementary for more than 20 years, was used to seeing squirrels stray cats and the occasional lost raccoon wandering near the schoolyard, but never a dog like this, never one that looked as if it had a purpose. The German Shepherd sat with perfect posture, tail curled around its paws, head-high eyes locked on the main entrance. Its fur, though dusty and slightly tangled, gleamed with the texture of discipline, not wildness. There was something unmistakably intelligent in its stillness. Most dogs twitch, sniff, or fidget. This one didn't move at all. Ellen slowed her steps as she crossed the parking lot, clutching her coffee mug with both hands, the steam fogging her glasses. The dog didn't flinch. It simply stared at her as if measuring her soul. For a moment, the world around her seemed to pause, the sound of the wind, the faint chatter of children arriving, even the rhythmic squeak of the janitor's mop inside the hall. Everything stilled except the connection between Ellen and that dog. She wasn't a person easily spooked, but something about those eyes unsettled her. They weren't just watchful, they were expectant. She took a tentative step forward, whispering, "Hey boy, are you lost?" The German Shepherd blinked once, then stood. Its movements were fluid, deliberate. It walked toward her paws, soft against the pavement, and gently placed something at her feet. Ellen looked down. It was an old plastic keychain shaped like an apple, faded scratched with a faint trace of red paint clinging to its edge. Her breath caught. The apple was nearly identical to the one painted on her classroom door. A cheerful red apple with her name, Mrs. Brooks, room 3A. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked it up. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Though, of course, no answer came. The dog tilted its head tail, lowering. Ellen felt a strange tug at her heart, the kind of feeling that comes when something old and half-forgotten brushes against the present. "All right," she said softly. "You're a mysterious one." She turned toward the school entrance, but as she did, the janitor, Mr. Dale, emerged from the side building holding a bucket. "That mutt been hanging around again," he grumbled. "I saw it yesterday too. I'll call animal control." "No," Ellen said quickly. "It's harmless. Dogs like that don't just sit still for nothing," Dale muttered. "It's trained or broken. Either way, can't have it scaring the kids." He waved his rag at the dog, but before he could take another step, the German Shepherd stood up, walked a few paces backward, and sat down again, as if to show it meant no harm, only distance. Ellen noticed the restraint, the discipline, and something in her softened. "Leave it," she said. "If it causes trouble, I'll handle it." Dale rolled his eyes. "Your call, teacher lady." He left muttering something about paperwork. Ellen turned back to the dog. It was watching her again, gaze steady, unwavering. She sighed, then headed into the building. The day unfolded as usual: math tests, reading practice, the endless rhythm of pencils tapping desks, yet her thoughts kept drifting to that dog. During recess, she found half her students pressed against the window. "Mrs. Brooks, it's still there," one shouted. "Can we feed it?" Ellen hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She let them go outside under her watch. The German Shepherd didn't react to the children's giggles or cautious steps. It simply sat regal and unmoving, like a statue, carved from loyalty itself. One brave boy tossed a piece of sandwich near its paws. The dog didn't eat it. Instead, it used its nose to push the bread back toward the fence and looked up straight into Ellen's eyes. That small gesture silenced everyone. "See," she said softly. "He's polite." The kids laughed nervously, but Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that something about this moment mattered. That night when she returned home, she couldn't stop thinking about the keychain. She set it on her kitchen table beside her lesson plans, turning it under the light. The red paint shimmered faintly, catching her reflection. It looked worn, but not dirty. Someone had cared for it once. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but deep down she knew better. Maplewood was a small town. Strange stories didn't just appear out of nowhere. The next morning she arrived early. Fog blanketed the schoolyard, erasing the horizon. The following morning felt heavier than usual. The autumn air carried a quiet tension that Ellen couldn't name, the kind that made her coffee taste dull and her shoes echo too loudly in the hallway. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that dog sitting by the gate, waiting through the fog like a sentinel of something long forgotten. As she turned the corner toward room 3A, she froze. The dog shadow, she decided silently, was already there. He had arrived before her again. His fur glistened with dew, his breath fogging in the cool morning air. He didn't bark or approach. He simply stared at her, unblinking, as though continuing a conversation they had left unfinished. Ellen sighed, clutching her scarf tighter. "You really don't plan on leaving, do you?" she muttered. The dog tilted his head slightly, the faintest response. It was then that she noticed something different, something she had somehow overlooked before. The leather collar around his neck was thick, dark brown, weathered but intact. Under the morning light, she spotted a small bulge beneath one edge of the collar. Her pulse quickened. She knelt, extending a slow, open hand. "Easy boy," she whispered. Shadow stood perfectly still, allowing her fingers to graze the rough leather. She felt the uneven texture, then the corner of something stiff tucked inside. A piece of folded paper, no an envelope, yellowed and thin. Her stomach turned as she carefully slipped it out. The paper was damp and faintly scented of smoke, as if it had survived more than just weather. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single note, written in shaky handwriting with a blue pen. "His name is Shadow. He's not lost. He's looking for someone who once taught me to believe in kindness." That was all. No name, no address, no explanation. Just those haunting words. Ellen stood frozen, the words burning into her mind. Someone who once taught me to believe in kindness. She read it over and over until the edges blurred. Who could have written this? A former student, a parent? The phrase struck her as deeply personal, something connected to her past, yet she couldn't place it. She looked down. Shadow was watching her, unmoving, his tail resting quietly on the cold pavement. "Did someone send you to me?" she whispered. At the sound of her voice, the dog's ears twitched. "Shadow," she tried aloud, testing the name written on the note. The instant the word left her lips, the dog lowered his head in recognition, almost like a bow. Ellen's chest tightened. He knew that name. He had been waiting for someone to say it. The connection between them deepened in that moment, silent but undeniable. When the first bell rang, she slipped the note into her coat pocket and ushered her students inside. But every few minutes she caught herself glancing toward the window. Shadow was still there, his gaze steady, never wandering. During lunch, she sat at her desk, staring at the note again. The handwriting was uneven, each letter slightly slanted, written with care, but trembling. She ran her thumb along the words and whispered them again, softer this time, as if they might answer back. "Someone who once taught me to believe in kindness." She thought of her years teaching in the district, the hundreds of children who had passed through her classroom, some bright-eyed, some broken. Maybe it was one of them. Maybe this was someone's way of repaying something small she didn't even remember doing. The thought both comforted and terrified her. Later that afternoon, as the sky turned orange, Ellen decided to stay late to grade essays. The hallways were emptying out, the faint echo of sneakers fading into silence. When she looked up, Shadow was still sitting outside the window. She smiled faintly. "You're loyal." "I'll give you that," she said, half to herself. The dog blinked slowly, his tail tapping the ground once rhythmically, as though he understood. She reached for her bag and decided she couldn't just leave him there again. "All right," she sighed. "Come on, Shadow." She opened the side door and stepped outside. To her surprise, the dog didn't rush in. Instead, he took a cautious step forward, sniffed the ground near her feet, and then sat just inside the doorway, waiting for her cue. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. The way he listened, so alert, so patient, made her heart ache. He wasn't a stray. He was trained, disciplined. Someone had loved him deeply. Someone had written that letter. As she reached down to adjust his collar, she noticed faint markings along the edge, letters and numbers, almost rubbed away. She squinted under the fading light. K972 in precinct. Her blood ran cold. "You're a police dog," she breathed. Shadow didn't react. He just looked up at her, his amber eyes glimmering in the dusk. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind. An officer, an accident, a message, a connection to her classroom. It all felt too intentional to be random. Ellen closed the door behind them and walked slowly toward her classroom. Shadow's paused, silent on the linoleum floor. The school felt different now, haunted by something unseen but kind. The smell of chalk, the hum of the heater, even the bulletin board covered in spelling words, all of it seemed smaller next to the presence of this animal. She sat down at her desk, Shadow resting beside her feet. For a few long minutes, she just watched him breathe. He had scars along his flank, healed but visible under the short fur, the kind earned from loyalty, not aggression. She reached down and whispered, "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The next day began with the kind of rain that seeps into the bones, slow and persistent. The gray sky hung low over Maplewood Elementary, and by the time Ellen arrived, puddles had formed across the playground like small, trembling mirrors. Shadow was there again, sitting by the gate, soaked but unmoving. Water dripped from his muzzle, his fur clinging to his frame, yet his gaze was steady, fixed once more on the classroom window. Ellen stood under her umbrella, her heart twisting. "You're going to freeze out here," she murmured. The dog blinked slowly, unbothered by the weather, a quiet resilience emanating from every inch of him. She hesitated, then made her decision. "Fine," she whispered. "You win." She led him towards the side entrance, pausing only to wipe her shoes on the mat before unlocking the classroom door. The warmth hit them both, instantly carrying the faint smell of crayons and old books. Shadow shook off the rain near the door, careful not to get too close to the desks. His manners, as always, surprised her. When the first few students arrived, their eyes widened, gasps filling the room. "Mrs. Brooks, there's a dog in class," one girl shouted. "He's not a dog," Liam said softly from the back of the room, his voice barely audible. Everyone turned toward him in shock. Liam rarely spoke. He was a quiet, withdrawn boy with big eyes and hair that always fell into his face. Ellen had often worried about him, how he seemed invisible in a world that demanded noise. "His name is Shadow," Ellen said, gently smiling at the boy. "He's just staying dry today." Shadow didn't approach the excited students who crowded near him. Instead, he walked calmly across the room and sat down beside Liam's desk. He didn't bark, didn't beg for attention. He simply sat there, lowering his head slightly as if to say, "I'm here for you." Ellen watched, holding her breath. Liam stared back at the dog for a long moment before slowly reaching out. His small hand trembled as his fingers brushed against Shadow's fur. The German Shepherd didn't move, just exhaled softly through his nose. The connection between them was quiet, but electric. The rest of the class, so often noisy and restless, fell completely silent. Ellen couldn't explain it, but she felt something shift in the room. It was as if the air itself softened. The school day began as usual, math reading and the low hum of rain against the windows, but Shadow remained curled at Liam's side the entire time, his eyes half closed, yet always alert. During lunch, the students begged Ellen to let him stay. "Please, Mrs. Brooks. He's so calm he doesn't even bark. He's better behaved than we are," Ellen laughed softly. That's not saying much. Still, she couldn't ignore how peaceful the classroom felt. Even the usual troublemakers seemed subdued, their laughter more gentle than mocking. It was as if Shadow had brought with him an invisible harmony, one that words couldn't teach. After recess, when the storm showed no sign of ending, she decided to keep the children indoors for reading hour. The lights dimmed, and the only sound was the patter of rain outside. "All right," Ellen said. "Who wants to read first?" No one moved. Books rustled nervously, eyes avoided hers. Then unexpectedly, a hand rose. It was Liam. Ellen froze. "Go ahead, sweetheart," she said softly. Liam stood holding his tattered copy of Charlotte's Web. His voice was quiet, at first, shaky, uncertain. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" he began. The room was silent, except for the rain and his trembling voice. As he read, Shadow lifted his head and placed one paw gently over Liam's shoe, anchoring him. The moment was so still that Ellen felt tears prick her eyes. The boy continued growing stronger with each sentence. When he reached the end of the page, his voice didn't waver anymore. The other children stared wide-eyed, moved but unsure why. When he finished, the silence lingered until someone whispered, "Wow." Then came applause, soft, hesitant at first, then growing until it filled the entire classroom. Ellen swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in her throat. "Beautifully done, Liam," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor. Later, when the children had gone, Ellen sat alone at her desk, the rain still drumming against the glass. Shadow lay at her feet, his breathing deep and slow. She reached down to stroke his head. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. The dog's eyes flicked open, calm and knowing. She remembered the note. "He's not lost. He's looking for someone who once taught me to believe in kindness." Maybe that someone wasn't her after all. Maybe it was this boy. Maybe Shadow had come to heal someone else. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that all of them were somehow connected through invisible threads of kindness and pain. That night, she couldn't bring herself to leave him outside again. She opened the supply closet, spread an old blanket on the floor, and whispered, "You can stay here tonight, Shadow." The dog circled once and lay down his eyes, softening as if relieved. The next morning arrived with a streak of sunlight breaking through the clouds, the first hint of warmth after days of endless rain. Ellen unlocked her classroom door, the familiar smell of chalk and pencil shavings greeting her as she set her coffee down. She half expected to see Shadow already at the gate, and sure enough, there he was waiting exactly where he always did. His coat looked cleaner now. The children must have brushed him during recess the day before. He stood when he saw her tail moving slowly in a half wag, his eyes filled with something almost human. Ellen smiled despite the ache of curiosity that hadn't left her since she found that letter. She had lain awake most of the night, wondering who had written it, who had owned him, and why the name Shadow felt both foreign and familiar at once. She needed to know. During her planning period that morning, she picked up the phone and called the local animal shelter, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. "Yes," she said. "I'm calling about a German Shepherd male, 6 or 7 years old, large build, wearing a leather collar marked K972, End Precinct." The woman on the other end went silent. Then she sighed. "Ma'am, can I ask where you found him?" "He's been showing up at my school for several days," Ellen said. "I found a note on his collar." Another pause, heavier this time. "That dog's name is Shadow," the woman said softly. "He belonged to Officer Thomas Reed. The officer was killed in a highway accident 2 months ago. The night it happened, Shadow disappeared. We thought he'd been hit too, but no trace was found." Ellen's chest tightened. "You're saying he's been missing all this time?" "Yes, ma'am. That dog sat outside the crash site for 3 days. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't move." One of the responders finally coaxed him into a van, but he escaped from the shelter the next morning. We put up notices everywhere, but no one's seen him since, until now." Ellen swallowed hard. "Thomas Reed," she repeated quietly. The name echoed through her mind like an old song she almost remembered. "Do you know if Officer Reed had any family? A son," the woman said. "Lived in this town once, I think. Name was Thomas Jr. Moved away years ago after his mother died. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 back then." "Thank you," Ellen whispered, her throat tight. "That helps more than you know." She hung up, her heart pounding. Thomas Reed. The name clung to her memory like dust on glass. She turned slowly toward the wall above her desk, where a framed class photo hung the group of children she had taught 12 years ago, her first year at Maplewood Elementary. She stepped closer, scanning the faces, the gap-toothed smiles, the freckles, the pigtails. And then she saw him. Third row right side, a boy with light brown hair and bright blue eyes grinning shyly at the camera. Thomas Reed Jr. Her knees nearly gave way. She remembered him now. A quiet, polite boy, always drawing police cars in the margins of his notebooks. His father was a police officer, proud and loving, always coming to school events in uniform. The memory hit her with such force that she had to grip the edge of her desk to steady herself. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You came back for me, didn't you?" The realization sent chills down her spine. She turned toward Shadow, who had been lying near the door half asleep. "Shadow," she called softly. The dog lifted his head instantly, eyes bright and alert. "Thomas Reed," she said. The effect was immediate. Shadow stood up, ears sharp, tail frozen midair. Then, without hesitation, he walked past her, crossing the classroom floor with quiet, deliberate steps. He stopped in front of the photo wall and looked up. Ellen's breath caught as she followed his gaze. He was staring directly at the face of young Thomas Reed Jr. "You knew him," she whispered. Shadow's body relaxed slightly, and for a brief moment, she could almost see his heart breaking behind those steady eyes. Ellen knelt beside him, resting a trembling hand on his neck. "You've been trying to tell me," she murmured. "You weren't lost. You were looking for the person who once looked after your boy's teacher." Her voice cracked as she spoke the words aloud. The magnitude of it hit her all at once. The loyalty, the grief, the endless search that brought this dog back to the one place that carried meaning from another life. That afternoon, the weather cleared, and the students begged to take Shadow outside. Ellen agreed, needing the air as much as they did. The children laughed as Shadow trotted around the playground, chasing nothing in particular, his spirit lighter for the first time. Even Liam, usually quiet, ran alongside him, smiling openly. Ellen sat on a bench watching them, the pieces of the puzzle spinning in her mind. Thomas Jr. had once written her a note on the last day of school. She could still picture the blue ink and crooked handwriting. "Thank you for being kind to me when I was scared. My dad says good teachers are heroes too." She had kept that note for years before losing it during a classroom move. Now, looking at Shadow, she felt that note come alive again in the form of a dog who refused to forget. When the bell rang, the students went home, and Ellen lingered by the gate, waiting for Shadow to settle back into his usual post. The setting sun turned his coat gold, a radiant halo of devotion. "You're carrying his heart, aren't you?" she said softly. Shadow looked up, and for the briefest moment she swore she saw recognition in his eyes, not of her, but of the name she had spoken, the connection they both shared to someone who was gone. She walked home in silence that night, her thoughts tangled between memory and mystery. That evening, Ellen sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers, the yellow light of her desk lamp flickering over stacks of old folders and student files she hadn't opened in years. The rain tapped gently against the window, steady and rhythmic, the kind of sound that invited memories back from wherever they had been hiding. Shadow lay curled beside her chair, breathing deeply, occasionally twitching in his sleep as if chasing something in a dream. The conversation from that morning still echoed in her mind. Officer Thomas Reed, the crash, the missing dog, the son she had once taught. The name had awakened something inside her, an ache she couldn't ignore. She pulled out a stack of old class photos, her fingers trembling as she flipped through each one. There in the folder labeled Class of 2009, she found a letter folded between the pages of a scrapbook filled with old drawings and thank you cards. Her breath caught as she unfolded the worn piece of paper, the faint blue ink still visible despite time's attempt to erase it. The handwriting was uneven, the kind of messy loops only a 10-year-old could make. Dear Mrs. Brooks, thank you for helping me when I was scared to read out loud. My dad says you're the bravest teacher he's ever met. I want to be like you one day and help people who are scared too. Maybe I'll be a police officer when I grow up. Dad says that's a good way to be brave. It was signed, your student Thomas Reed, Jr. Ellen pressed her hand over her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. She remembered the day he had given her that letter, right before summer break, when he'd been quiet and shy, and his father had come to pick him up in uniform. She could still picture Officer Reed's smile, his hand on his son's shoulder, the pride in his voice when he said, "He wants to make a difference someday, just like you." The memory of it now felt like an echo, something half remembered but painfully vivid. She read the letter again, each word cutting deeper until she could hardly breathe. Then she looked down at Shadow, still sleeping peacefully on the floor. "You were his partner," she whispered. "You were his other half. And you came back here for me." It didn't make sense, not logically, but somehow she knew it was true. Shadow's loyalty had carried him through loss and distance, and now it had brought him home to the one person tied to both father and son. As the night deepened, Ellen's exhaustion pulled her into a restless sleep right there at the table. Her dream began in the classroom. The desks were smaller, the air filled with sunlight and the faint scent of chalk. Children's laughter echoed down the halls, bright and innocent. And there he was, Thomas Jr., sitting at his desk, smiling up at her as if no time had passed. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice still that soft mix of confidence and hesitation. Behind him at the classroom window stood Shadow Younger, sleeker, watching over the class like a silent guardian. Ellen walked toward them, reaching out, but the sunlight grew brighter, swallowing the scene until all she could see was the dog's amber eyes. Then the dream changed. She was standing outside the school gate holding the plastic Apple keychain in her hand. The keychain glowed faintly, and when she looked up, the gate was empty, the fog rolling in like a memory, fading away. "Don't forget him," a voice whispered, familiar, childlike. She woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house was dark, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the dream, but something felt different. The air was cold, too still. She glanced down at Shadow, but he wasn't by her chair anymore. Panic gripped her until she saw movement by the door. He was sitting there facing it, perfectly alert, but calm. Ellen stood slowly, following his gaze. Something glinted faintly under the door's edge. She bent down and froze. Lying on the welcome mat, faintly damp from dew, was the Apple keychain. Her throat closed. She had locked it inside her desk at school before she left. It wasn't possible. She picked it up with trembling fingers, the plastic still cool from the night air. "How?" she whispered. Shadow turned his head toward her tail, moving once softly. It was as if he already knew she'd find it there. Ellen sat down beside him on the floor, her mind spinning between grief and wonder. "You're trying to tell me something," she said quietly. "You want me to remember him." The dog rested his head on her knee, warm and steady. She stayed like that for a long time, listening to his breathing and the faint sound of rain outside, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The next morning, Ellen brought the keychain with her to school, unable to leave it behind. When she walked through the gates, the sunrise bathed the yard in soft gold, the world cleaner and newer than it had been the day before. Shadow trotted beside her, his steps matching hers like an old friend's rhythm. She placed the Apple keychain on her desk where the morning light caught it, the faint reflection dancing across the chalkboard. For the first time in years, the classroom felt alive, not just with noise and color, but with purpose. The peace Ellen had felt the past few days didn't last long. Word about the teacher's dog began to spread through the small Vermont town faster than she expected. At first, it was harmless curiosity. Parents dropping off their kids lingered longer by the gate, smiling at the sight of the German Shepherd sitting so obediently beside Ellen. Some even took photos. But by the end of the week, those whispers turned into questions, and questions turned into rumors. "Isn't that dangerous?" one parent asked. "Shouldn't the school have a policy about animals?" another added. Ellen brushed it off at first, insisting that Shadow was gentle and well-trained, but she could feel the tide shifting. By Monday morning, a letter arrived from the district office, stamped with urgency and bureaucratic precision. She unfolded it slowly at her desk, reading each word like a blow. For liability and safety concerns, the animal referred to as Shadow must be removed from school premises immediately. Ellen's stomach twisted. She read it again, hoping she had misunderstood. Removed immediately. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the room where Shadow lay quietly beside Liam's desk, his head resting on his paws, watching her with those deep, knowing eyes. "They can't," she whispered under her breath. The bell rang, and soon the classroom filled with laughter, chatter, and the squeak of sneakers against the linoleum floor. But Ellen couldn't focus. She smiled when she needed to taught her lessons as always, yet her mind kept circling back to the letter folded in her pocket like a sentence waiting to be carried out. At recess, she called the principal's office. "We can discuss it tomorrow," Principal Harris said, his tone firm but not unkind. "District officials will come for an inspection. They just need to make sure the environment is safe. Shadow is not a threat," Ellen insisted. "He's trained, calm, gentle. He's helped one of my students speak for the first time in years." "I know," Harris said softly, "but rules are rules." She hung up, anger and helplessness burning in her chest. That night, she stayed late again, grading papers as Shadow lay quietly at her feet. She stared at the letter for a long time before whispering, "They don't understand you, do they?" He lifted his head, eyes soft, and rested it on her knee. She stroked his fur absently, her mind racing for solutions she didn't have. When she finally left, she paused at the classroom door, looking back at the Apple keychain on her desk. It glowed faintly under the lamp, a reminder of everything. Shadow represented hope, connection, and the quiet persistence of love that refused to fade. The next morning, the officials arrived earlier than expected. 2 men in gray suits and a woman from the district stepped into the classroom just after the first bell. Ellen greeted them calmly, though her heart pounded. "This is a routine safety assessment," one of them explained, adjusting his clipboard. "We just need to observe." Shadow sat upright beside Liam's desk, tail tucked neatly around his legs, posture perfect, eyes following every movement without aggression. Ellen tried to focus on her lesson, pretending not to notice the whispering adults in the back of the room scribbling notes. The tension in the air was heavy, and the students felt it too. Even the most talkative ones sat unusually quiet. Then it happened. One of the officials, a tall man with a polished tie, walked over to Liam's desk, pretending to compliment his artwork. "What are you drawing?" he asked, reaching down to pick up the paper without waiting for permission. The moment his fingers touched the drawing, Shadow stood up. The sound that followed wasn't a snarl. It was a low, protective growl, quiet, but powerful enough to stop the man mid-motion. Every child froze. The official stepped back quickly, face pale, his clipboard clattering to the floor. Ellen's heart dropped, but before she could speak, Liam stood up, placing himself between Shadow and the man. "He's not bad," the boy said, firmly, voice trembling, but strong. "He's protecting me. That's what he does." The silence that followed was electric. The official blinked, uncertain what to say. Ellen finally found her voice. "He's right," she said softly. "Shadow isn't dangerous. He's loyal. He's doing exactly what he was trained to do, protect the people he loves." The other children nodded slowly, murmuring in agreement. "He helped Liam," one said. "He makes us feel safe," said another. The woman from the district adjusted her glasses, clearly moved but trying to maintain composure. "It's unusual," she said, glancing at the men beside her. "But it's remarkable," Ellen exhaled shakily, placing a gentle hand on Shadow's head. "He's not a problem to be solved," she said. "He's part of what's right about this place." The meeting ended without a clear verdict. The officials left quietly, still whispering to one another, their expressions thoughtful rather than dismissive. Ellen slumped into her chair after the final bell exhaustion washing over her. Liam approached her holding the drawing the man had nearly taken. "I drew this for him," he said shyly. She looked down. It was a picture of Shadow sitting beside the classroom window, sunlight streaming in with the words, "Good Boy Protector of 3A," written across the top in bright crayon. Ellen smiled through tears. "It's perfect," she said. When she turned back to Shadow, he was lying down again, tail sweeping the floor gently, his gaze warm and calm. The rest of the day passed quietly. Parents began hearing about what happened, and instead of fear, admiration started to spread. The story reached the local paper, German Shepherd Protects class, during inspection, and within hours, the school's inbox flooded with messages from people around the county praising the dog's loyalty and the bravery of a little boy who had stood up for him. The night after the inspection felt endless. Though the district officials had left without taking action, Ellen couldn't shake the unease lingering inside her chest. She had spent hours replaying the scene in her head, the way Shadow stood protectively, the way Liam defended him, the silent awe that followed. The story had reached the local paper, and parents began sending letters of support. But Ellen knew the district wouldn't let the issue rest for long. Shadow had become both hero and controversy, a symbol of loyalty that the world still didn't know how to handle. That evening, after the last student had left and the janitor's footsteps faded down the hall, Ellen stayed behind to tidy up. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust and rain drifting in through a cracked window. She walked between the rows of desks, stacking papers, straightening chairs, her mind elsewhere. Shadow lay near the back of the room, resting his head on his paws, eyes following her every move. She smiled weakly at him. "You're always watching, aren't you?" she said softly. He didn't move, only blinked slowly in answer. She sat down beside him, reaching to scratch behind his ears, and as her hand brushed against the back of his collar, she felt something unusual, a small raised seam along the inner lining that hadn't been there before, or maybe she had never noticed. Her brow furrowed. Carefully, she turned the collar over and ran her fingers along it. There was something hidden beneath the leather. She hesitated, then used a paperclip from her desk to pry at the edge. A thin layer peeled back, revealing a tiny fold of waterproof tape sealing something flat inside. Her pulse quickened. "What are you hiding, boy?" she whispered. Gently, she pulled it out. It was a small folded piece of paper, yellowed but intact, protected from time and weather by care and intention. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neater than the first letters, steady, purposeful. The words were few, but each one carried weight. "If you're reading this, it means Shadow found her, the teacher who once gave my son hope when the world felt too heavy. Please let him stay where kindness lives." It was signed Officer Thomas Reed. Ellen's hands began to tremble. The edges of the paper fluttered as her breath hitched. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered. The words blurred through tears. "You sent him back." She glanced at Shadow, who now sat upright, ears tilted, watching her carefully. "You came here because he asked you to," she murmured. "You remembered." Shadow tilted his head, and though she knew dogs couldn't cry, she could have sworn she saw something human in the quiet sorrow of his gaze. She turned the paper over, and for a moment thought it was blank, until she noticed another smaller fold tucked into the corner. It was a note written in childish scrawl, uneven and innocent. "Dad, if something happens, send Shadow to Mrs. Brooks. She'll know what to do," signed Tommy. The sight of that name broke her. She pressed the paper to her chest, sobbing softly in the empty classroom. It all made sense now. The Apple keychain, the way Shadow watched her window, his patience, his purpose. He hadn't been wandering aimlessly. He had been following the last instructions of two people whose love had survived tragedy. When her tears finally stopped, she sat back in her chair, the papers spread before her like sacred relics. The weight of it all pressed down on her, the faith those two had placed in her, without her knowing the quiet thread of connection stretching across years and loss. She looked at Shadow again. "You did it," she said quietly. "You kept your promise." He walked over, slowly laying his head in her lap. She stroked his fur with both hands, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You were his last gift," she whispered. "And somehow you found your way home." The sound of rain began outside, light at first, then heavier. The room dimmed as the clouds swallowed the evening light. Ellen turned on her desk lamp and placed both letters under the warm glow, her eyes tracing the ink until she could almost hear their voices. Officer Reed's strength in the steady handwriting, Tommy's innocence in the crooked lines, both bound together through this one loyal creature who refused to forget. She folded the letters back carefully and tucked them into a folder marked personal. They didn't belong to the world, they were hers now, something private and sacred between her, the boy, and the father who had kept his word beyond death. Later that night, as she walked to her car, Shadow trotted quietly beside her, the puddles reflecting the glow of streetlights. She unlocked the door and hesitated, looking down at him. "You want to come home tonight?" she asked. He blinked once, as if to say yes. She smiled and opened the passenger door. "All right, Officer Reed," she said softly, the title slipping from her lips before she could stop it. "You've earned it." Shadow climbed in gracefully, curling into the seat. On the drive home, Ellen kept glancing at him, marveling at how life could twist and return in circles, binding the living and the lost. When they arrived, she poured herself a cup of tea and placed the letters on the kitchen table. The rain continued outside, tapping against the window pane. Shadow rested by the door, his eyes half closed, his body finally relaxed, as though some invisible burden had lifted. Ellen sat across from him, reading the letters again, whispering the words under her breath. "Let him stay where kindness lives." It wasn't just a plea, it was a command written in love. The morning after Ellen found the hidden letters, she woke before sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently in her life. The world outside was quiet, the streets washed clean from the storm. She brewed her coffee, sat at the kitchen table, staring at the Apple keychain, and reread the words that had haunted her all night. "Let him stay where kindness lives." She traced the ink with her thumb, the handwriting now burned into her heart. Shadow sat by the door, his posture calm, but alert eyes flicking toward her with that familiar patience. "You knew all along," she murmured. He tilted his head slightly, almost acknowledging her thought, and for the first time, she smiled without sadness. When she arrived at school, the sky had cleared to a soft blue, the air carrying the scent of wet earth and morning dew. Shadow trotted beside her as usual, greeting Liam and the other children as they arrived. The students now treated him like a guardian spirit, whispering to him as if he understood every word. Even Principal Harris, who once hesitated to allow him inside, now greeted him with a reluctant smile and a scratch behind the ear. The story from the newspaper had done something unexpected. It had united the community. People stopped by to bring food toys and thank you letters addressed to Shadow. For the first time in years, the little school felt alive with warmth and purpose. But Ellen knew there was one last piece of the story missing. She had letters, memories, and pieces of truth, but not the whole of it. She wanted to know how far Shadow had traveled, how long he had been searching, and why his journey had led him back here, exactly when it did. The answer came the next afternoon. Ellen was sorting reading assignments when the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway. She looked up as a tall man in a police uniform appeared at the door. His hair was streaked with gray, his face lined but kind. "Mrs. Brooks?" he asked gently. "Yes," she replied, setting her papers down. "I'm Captain Michael Reed. Thomas Reed was my younger brother." The air seemed to thicken around her. "Your brother?" she whispered. He nodded. "I read the story in the paper about the German Shepherd. I had to see him myself. You have no idea how long we searched for that dog." At the sound of the word dog, Shadow, who had been napping by the bookshelf, lifted his head. The moment his eyes met Michael's, his entire body stilled. Then, as if recognizing a voice from another life, he stood, walked forward slowly, and pressed his head against Michael's leg. The captain froze, emotion flickering across his face before he knelt down and wrapped his arms around Shadow. "Good boy," he whispered, voice breaking. "You found her, didn't you?" Ellen stood speechless, watching the scene unfold. The air seemed to hum with the weight of love, grief, and reunion. After a long moment, Michael stood wiping his eyes. "He ran away the night after my brother's funeral," he said softly. "We looked everywhere, miles of Forest Town's roads. I should have known he wasn't lost. He was looking for someone." Ellen's throat tightened. "Your brother's letter," she said. "He mentioned me." Michael nodded slowly. "Tom talked about you often. Said you were the teacher who changed his boy's life, helped him believe in himself again after his mother passed. When he was writing his will, he asked me to promise that if anything happened, I'd make sure Shadow found his way to you. But I didn't have to. Shadow did it himself." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "I found this in my brother's old locker. I think it belongs to you." Ellen took it with shaking hands and carefully unfolded the photograph inside. Her breath caught. The picture showed a younger Thomas Reed standing in front of a squad car, one arm around his smiling son, the other resting on Shadow's back. In Thomas Jr.'s small hands was a handmade sign that read, "To the teacher who saved my childhood. We're coming back to thank you someday." Ellen covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. He remembered she whispered. Michael's voice was gentle. He never forgot. Neither did Shadow. She sank into her chair, holding the photograph close. The memories came rushing back, Thomas Jr. shyly handing her the Apple keychain, his father. Thanking her after a parent-teacher conference, their laughter echoing in the hallway. She realized that the photo had captured not just a moment, but a promise fulfilled by the one creature who refused to let it die. "He carried their love all this way," Ellen said, her voice trembling. "He brought it back to where it began." Michael smiled sadly. "Dogs like Shadow don't move on easily. They carry the hearts of those who loved them until they find somewhere safe to leave them." He reached down and patted Shadow's head. "Looks like he found it." That afternoon, Michael stayed for a while, telling stories about his brother and nephew, the fishing trips, the birthdays, the long nights Thomas Jr. spent training with Shadow before college. Each story painted a fuller picture of the family Ellen had unknowingly become part of. When the final bell rang, students crowded around, eager to meet the visitor. Michael knelt to greet them, answering their questions with warmth. Shadow stayed close to Liam, resting a paw on the boy's shoe like always, but his eyes followed Michael's every move. Before leaving, Michael handed Ellen a folded letter sealed with the precinct's insignia. "This was found with Tom's personal effects," he said. "It's addressed to you." She didn't open it right away. She waited until the school was empty and the sun dipped below the trees, turning the windows gold. Sitting at her desk, Shadow beside her, she broke the seal and read, "Dear Mrs. Brooks, if you're reading this, it means my old partner has done his job again. He's stubborn, loyal, and smarter than most men I know. I don't know where life will take my boy or what will happen to me, but I want you to know that the kindness you gave us all those years ago never left our hearts. I named my son's dog Shadow because you told him once that light can't exist without shadow. I guess that was your way of saying hope stays with us even in the dark. If he's with you, please keep him. He's where he belongs." The tears came without warning, soft at first, then uncontrollable. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across Vermont with a quiet ferocity that made even the bravest stay indoors. The trees around Maplewood Elementary stood bare, their branches coated with frost like glass. The newspapers had run one more story about Shadow after Captain Michael Reed's visit, the dog who kept a promise, and the town had fallen in love with the tale. People brought treats, blankets, and donations for the school, but Ellen knew that the true gift had already been given. Shadow's presence had changed everything. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He had become a living reminder that compassion once given never truly disappears. Yet as the days grew shorter and colder, Ellen began to notice a change in him. He slept more often, ate less, and moved slower. When he looked at her, there was still that spark of understanding, but behind it lingered something softer acceptance. She brushed it off as the chill of winter, unwilling to believe what her heart already feared. Then came the night of the storm. It was a Friday, and the snow began falling before noon. By the time the last bell rang, the sky had turned white with fury. The buses couldn't leave, and several parents called to say they were stranded on the icy roads. Ellen decided to keep the remaining students safe in her classroom until the weather cleared. The generator hummed as the snow piled high outside, cutting off the view of the world beyond. The children huddled in blankets, while Ellen read aloud by the glow of a lantern. Shadow lay by the door, his body tense, ears twitching at every gust of wind. The storm roared like a living thing, shaking the windows. "It's okay, boy," Ellen whispered, walking over to him. "We're safe here." But Shadow wasn't calm. He stood suddenly, staring toward the gate beyond the glass doors, tail low, muscles tight. His breath fogged the window pane as he pressed his nose against it, eyes searching through the snow. "What is it?" Liam asked softly, sitting up from his sleeping bag. "He's waiting," Ellen said quietly. "He thinks someone's coming." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. She didn't know who Shadow saw in that storm. Maybe Officer Reed, maybe the boy Thomas Jr., maybe both. But something in his posture told her he was seeing what she could not. She watched him for hours as the storm raged on, never moving from his place by the glass. Around midnight, the wind finally began to die down. The children fell asleep one by one, their breathing soft in the dim room. Ellen sat in her chair, exhaustion pulling at her eyes. She looked toward Shadow one last time before drifting off. He was still there, watching the snow unblinking. When dawn came, light seeped slowly through the cracks in the curtains. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in silence. Ellen awoke to the sound of the heater clicking back on. Her neck ached from sleeping upright, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then she noticed the quiet, the kind of stillness that carries meaning. "Shadow," she called softly. No response. She stood, her heart beginning to race. "Shadow." She hurried toward the door, her boots crunching softly on the floor. The snow outside glowed in the early light, untouched, except for a single trail of paw prints leading to the gate. Her breath caught as she followed them out. There, lying exactly where she had first found him months ago, was Shadow. His body was still half covered in snow, his head resting gently on his paws. The wind moved softly through his fur. Ellen dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she brushed the snow from his coat. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, not yet." But there was peace in his face, a calm so complete it broke her heart. His eyes were closed, his mouth slightly curved as though caught mid-smile. Around his neck, the collar gleamed faintly under the rising sun. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. Something was tucked beneath the leather again, another small fold of paper sealed in plastic. She pulled it free and opened it with trembling hands. Inside, written in the same steady handwriting as Officer Reed's previous letter, were 2 words: mission complete. Ellen pressed the note to her chest, tears spilling freely. The cold didn't touch her. The snow didn't matter. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling beside the dog who had changed her world, whispering his name into the quiet morning. "You did it, Shadow," she said through her tears. "You kept every promise." Behind her, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the schoolyard in gold. The gate, the playground, the Apple keychain still hanging in the window. They all shimmered under the light, as if the world itself was saying goodbye. When the children awoke, they found her still sitting by Shadow's side, holding his collar like a sacred relic. The news spread through the town before noon, and by evening, candles flickered outside the school fence. Parents, students, officers, and strangers came to pay their respects to the dog who had become a legend. The school board that once questioned his place now voted unanimously to honor him. A week later, a small memorial garden was built near the gate. They called it the Guardian's Rest. The Apple keychain was placed in a glass case beside his collar, the simple note framed above it. Ellen spoke at the ceremony, her voice steady, though her hands shook. "Shadow reminded us that kindness doesn't end," she said. "It carries on in memory, in love, in the choices we make. He taught us to see light even when the world seems dark. He taught us that promises matter." The crowd was silent, every eye glistening with tears. Liam stepped forward, placing his drawing of Shadow beneath the plaque. A crayon portrait of the dog sitting by the classroom window, sunlight streaming in. Spring came late that year, as if the world itself was reluctant to move on. The snow melted slowly, revealing the brown earth beneath soft and alive again. The garden at the school gate. The Guardian's Rest had become a sacred place for everyone in Maplewood. Every morning, students left flowers, drawings, and small trinkets beside Shadow's memorial stone, while parents paused to bow their heads before walking their children to class. The air around that spot always felt different, gentler, warmer, touched by something unseen. Ellen visited it daily before unlocking her classroom door. She would straighten the flowers, brush the leaves off the plaque, and whisper a quiet greeting. "Good morning, Shadow," she always said, and though there was no sound in reply, she felt the familiar comfort of his presence. The months after his passing had changed the school. The story of Shadow had reached beyond Vermont. Letters poured in from across the country. Teachers, officers, parents, and children who had read about him in newspapers or seen the televised tribute. They all spoke of how his story reminded them that love and loyalty are never wasted, even when the world forgets. Ellen read each letter carefully, saving them in a folder she labeled Shadow's Legacy. Principal Harris came to her one morning with an idea inspired by those letters. "Ellen," he said, "I think we should do more than remember him. We should continue what he started." She tilted her head. "What do you mean an animal therapy program?" he said. "In Shadow's name. We'll work with shelters, bring in rescue dogs, train them with local officers and volunteers, and let them visit the children who need them most. The boy he helped, Liam, he's proof of what one dog can do." Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "He'd like that," she whispered. "He'd love it." Over the next few months, the program took shape. Students and teachers painted the training room, families donated supplies, and the community came together in ways Ellen had never seen before. The name came easily: the Shadow Project. The logo featured a silhouette of a German shepherd sitting beside a child holding an apple. Liam's idea drawn from his last picture of Shadow. When the first group of therapy dogs arrived, the school filled with excitement. One of them, a gentle golden retriever named Daisy, reminded Ellen of Shadow's calm strength. She watched as Daisy rested her head in the lap of a nervous child who had just transferred schools, and she smiled, recognizing the same magic at work again. Word spread quickly. Soon, the Shadow Project expanded beyond Maplewood Elementary, reaching neighboring towns. What began as one dog's act of loyalty became a movement that touched hundreds of lives. Each visit brought healing comfort and quiet lessons about trust. Ellen often thought about how proud Thomas Reed and his son would be if they could see what their faithful companion had started. One sunny morning in June, the school held a dedication ceremony to mark the official launch of the project. Parents, teachers, officers, and children gathered around the memorial garden. A soft breeze carried the scent of lilac and fresh grass, and the sound of laughter drifted through the air. Liam stood at the podium taller now, his voice steady and clear. "Shadow taught us that love is louder than fear," he said. "He showed me how to be brave when I was scared, and I think he'd be happy knowing other kids will feel the same way I did because of him." His words brought tears to every eye in the crowd. When it was Ellen's turn to speak, she walked slowly to the microphone holding the Apple keychain in her hand. "There are some lessons you can't teach with words," she began. "Some lessons come quietly through kindness, through loyalty, through the gentle heart of a friend who asks for nothing in return." Shadow reminded us that goodness doesn't fade. It grows, it spreads, and it stays alive in the hearts of those who believe in it. She paused, glancing towards the gate where the dog had once sat. "He may be gone, but look around you. He's everywhere now, in every child who smiles, in every hand that helps, in every animal who finds a second chance." She held up the keychain, and the sunlight caught it perfectly, scattering light across the crowd. For one miraculous moment, the reflection on the window formed a shape, tall, graceful, unmistakably a German shepherd standing by the gate. Gasps filled the air. Children pointed, some whispering Shadow's name. Ellen felt her breath catch as her eyes filled with tears. She didn't blink, afraid the image might disappear. But even when the sunlight shifted, she could still feel him there. A warmth spread through her chest, gentle and certain. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling but full. The ceremony ended with applause, laughter, and tears. Officers unveiled a bronze statue of Shadow at the garden's center, his pose noble yet calm. One paw resting gently over the carved words, "He came home to kindness." That afternoon, Ellen sat alone on the bench beside the statue. The students had gone home, and the school was quiet, except for the hum of cicadas in the trees. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind move through the branches. "You did it, Shadow," she murmured. "You finished the mission, but you started something bigger." A light breeze brushed against her cheek, warm and soft like the touch of fur. She smiled, not opening her eyes. "I know you're here," she said. "You always are." The sun dipped lower, painting the world in gold, and she could almost see him again, sitting at the gate, watching over them, tail gently swaying. Somewhere deep inside, she knew he would never really leave. The end. Before we end this story, take a moment to let it sink in how one dog's quiet loyalty changed an entire town, how love outlasted even time itself. If this story touched you, if Shadow's journey reminded you of someone you once loved, or a promise you still keep, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to help this story reach more hearts, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one. Tell me in the comments what part of Shadow's story moved you the most. Was it his patience, his devotion, or the moment he fulfilled his promise? And where in the world are you watching from tonight? I read every single comment, and your stories mean more than you know.